Thank you for joining me on The Things That Bother Me. Follow the incentives. This is episode 4, the final installment in this series on rural America and the disappearing safety net. Let's recap quickly. Episode 1, the jobs aren't there. You cannot mandate employment into existence. Episode 2, when the safety net shrinks in fragile communities, instability accelerates. Episode 3, collapse doesn't stay rural. It spreads through networks, healthcare systems, labor markets, and migration patterns. Now we get to the real question. If job density hasn't increased, if infrastructure hasn't expanded, if rural hospitals are still closing, if grocery stores are still disappearing, then what is all this contraction actually about? Because policy is not random, budgets reflect priorities, and when tax relief flows upward while assistance tightens downward, that's not an accident, that's direction. Today we're not debating slogans, we're following incentives. We're following revenue, we're following spending, and we're asking the blunt question, if this isn't about creating work, if this isn't about building stability, then who is it actually benefiting? This is the finale. Let's get into it. Episode 4, follow the incentives. We've walked through the structure. Episode 1, the jobs aren't there. Episode 2, when the safety net shrinks in fragile economies, systems strain. Episode 3, destabilization doesn't stay rural, it spreads. Now we ask the final question. If this isn't about expanding employment, if this isn't about rebuilding infrastructure, if this isn't about strengthening regional stability, then what is it about? Policy is not random. Budget outcomes are not accidental. When you see assistance programs tightening across multiple categories, food, healthcare, housing, rural funding, at the same time that high-income tax burdens shrink and capital treatment becomes more favorable, you don't need conspiracy. You need arithmetic, revenue down, spending pressure up, and when deficits are politically uncomfortable, spending contracts. The real question is where? Section 1, revenue down, pressure redirected. When tax reductions disproportionately benefit top earners, major asset holders, and corporate capital, federal intake declines relative to baseline. You can argue that stimulates growth long term. But in the short and medium term, revenue compresses. When revenue compresses, lawmakers look for offsets. Offsetting through tax reversal at the top is politically difficult. Offsetting through eligibility tightening at the bottom is politically easier. So assistance programs become the lever, not because they are the only option, but because they are the least protected. That's not moral outrage. That's incentive structure. Section 2, work language as political cover. Public messaging says, work requirements, personal responsibility, reducing dependency. But if job density hasn't increased, if employer investment hasn't surged, if rural infrastructure hasn't expanded, then tightening eligibility does not create work. It reduces enrollment. Caseload decline becomes the measurable success. Not wage growth, not employer expansion. Enrollment reduction, that's a fiscal outcome, not a labor market outcome. Section 3, administrative contraction. You don't have to eliminate programs to shrink them. You can increase documentation requirements, add compliance checkpoints, reduce waiver flexibility, shorten benefit windows, narrow eligibility definitions. Every one of those moves reduces participation. Every reduction lowers outlays. On paper, spending declines, but the pressure doesn't disappear, it relocates to households, to local economies, to fragile systems already operating on thin margins. Section 4, the reverse shift in burden. Now let's talk plainly about burden. When top earners see substantial tax relief, through rate cuts, capital treatment, estate adjustments, or corporate advantages, the revenue base shifts. If that revenue gap is partially offset by shrinking programs serving low-income households, the net fiscal pressure moves downward. Lower-income households pay payroll taxes, pay sales taxes, pay fuel taxes, pay property taxes directly or indirectly through rent. Those taxes consume a larger percentage of low incomes than high incomes. Now add this. If assistance contracts at the same time, those households lose purchasing power. Food support shrinks, healthcare coverage narrows, housing assistance tightens, Energy support declines. So while tax relief concentrates upward, support contraction concentrates downward. That is directional. Call it redistribution upward, call it contraction downward, call it what you want. But it functions like a reverse transfer. Instead of wealth stabilizing the bottom absorbs more instability while the top retains more capital. And when billionaires pay an increasingly small effective share relative to their total wealth accumulation, while assistance shrinks for families already on the edge, the imbalance becomes structural. Not symbolic, structural. Section 5. Rural taxation without reinforcement. Rural residents are not tax-exempt. They pay payroll taxes, sales taxes, gas taxes, property taxes, federal income taxes. But what are they watching disappear? Hospitals, grocery stores, assistance offices, bank branches, clinics. When people feel taxed but not reinforced, instability follows. It doesn't matter which party they support. The math feels one-sided. Section 6. The margin collapse. We established earlier that rural economies operate on thin margins. Few employers, limited redundancy, minimal credit cushion. When assistance shrinks in that environment, the margin doesn't narrow slightly, it collapses. Families lose buffers, local spending declines, businesses shrink, migration increases, regional strain rises, and that strain does not stay confined. We covered that already. In closing, you can believe in smaller government. You can believe in capital concentration. You can believe billionaires should pay less. Those are ideological positions, but understand the trade-offs. If billionaires pay virtually nothing relative to their total wealth accumulation, if capital gains treatment remains highly favorable, if effective tax burdens at the very top decline, and at the same time assistance shrinks for households living paycheck to paycheck, you are shifting instability downward. You are removing buffer from those with the least. And when millions lose small stabilizers, the system becomes more volatile. Not more disciplined, more volatile. You should be at least a little concerned about a structure where the wealthiest accumulate at scale with minimal friction, while families at the bottom lose food support, healthcare access, housing stability, and credit buffers. Because instability doesn't only threaten the poor. It destabilizes labor markets. It pressures healthcare networks. It strains housing supply. It increases migration volatility. It amplifies social tension. A system that concentrates relief at the top while removing stabilizers at the bottom becomes top-heavy. And top-heavy systems tilt. You can defend the philosophy, but defend it honestly. If the goal is to shrink assistance roles, say it. If the goal is to preserve capital at the highest levels, say it. But don't disguise contraction as empowerment. Don't call enrollment reduction job creation. And don't assume instability won't spread, because we already established that it does. This isn't about resentment, it's about structure. Revenue down, support down, fragility up. And fragility does not stay contained. It moves. The only question is whether people are paying attention before the shift becomes impossible to ignore. Series closing, the geography of collapse. We began this series with a question that shouldn't have been controversial. Where are the jobs? Not the speeches, not the campaign slogans, not the moral lectures, the actual jobs. And in too many rural counties, they simply aren't there. You cannot mandate employment into existence. You cannot punish vacancy into productivity. You cannot enforce participation in an economy that has already thinned out. That was the foundation. Then we looked at what happens when the thin layer of stability holding fragile communities together starts to disappear. Not luxuries, not excess, margins, food assistance that keeps a grocery store viable, healthcare coverage that keeps a rural hospital open, credit access that keeps a family afloat for one more month. Remove those margins and you don't create resilience. You create exposure. That was the second layer. Then we widen the lens, because some people think collapse can be quarantined. They think instability is geographic. They think suffering is selective. They think consequences respect county lines. They don't. Healthcare strain spreads. Migration pressure spreads. Economic contraction spreads. Social instability spreads. Destabilization is not partisan, it is structural. and structures respond to pressure, not ideology. That was the third layer. Then we followed the incentives. Revenue shrinks at the top, spending tightens at the bottom. Enrollment drops, assistance narrows, billionaires accumulate even more, families lose all assistance. You don't need conspiracy, you need math. If the wealthiest households pay virtually nothing relative to the scale of their asset growth, if capital is protected, if tax burdens lighten upward, and at the same time food support shrinks, healthcare eligibility tightens, housing assistance contracts, then the direction is clear. The system is concentrating stability upward and distributing risk downward. That is not symbolic. That is structural. You can call it efficiency. You can call it reform. You can call it discipline. But don't pretend it is neutral. Because when millions of households lose small stabilizers at once, volatility doesn't stay contained. It accumulates. And when volatility accumulates in a system already stretched thin, it doesn't politely knock. It destabilizes labor markets, it stresses hospitals, it strains cities, it fuels migration under pressure, it deepens distrust, and it amplifies division. A country can survive disagreement, it cannot indefinitely survive imbalance. When too much capital pools at the top and too much instability pools at the bottom, the structure becomes top-heavy. And top-heavy systems do not remain steady, they tilt, they sway, they strain. And eventually they correct. Not because someone voted wrong, not because someone cheered, but because pressure always redistributes. You can hollow out margins, you can shrink buffers, you can celebrate lower enrollment numbers. But you cannot remove stabilizers from millions of people and expect the broader structure to remain untouched. This series was not about defending dependency. It was not about attacking wealth. It was about understanding systems. Geography matters, infrastructure matters, redundancy matters, margins matter, because margins are what prevent shocks from becoming collapses, and once margins are gone, you are no longer managing growth. You are managing instability. You are no longer debating policy, you are negotiating with pressure, and pressure is patient. It builds quietly, it compounds silently, until one day it is no longer quiet. The real danger is not that rural America struggles. The real danger is believing that struggle can be isolated. Because when a nation shifts protection upward and pushes risk downward, it doesn't eliminate fragility. It concentrates it. And concentrated fragility does not stay dormant. It moves, it spreads, it corrects. And when it does, it will not ask who thought it was justified. It will only reveal who understood how the structure actually worked. And structures don't collapse because people complain. They collapse because the weight at the top finally exceeds the strength at the bottom. That's the series, 4 episodes, 4 layers, jobs that don't exist, safety nets that are thinning, destabilization that doesn't stay local, and incentives that tell the real story. If you made it through all 4, you now understand something most surface-level conversations never touch. This isn't just about work. It isn't just about rural America. It isn't just about politics. It's about structure. It's about margin. It's about what happens when stability gets concentrated at the top while risk gets pushed downward. You don't have to agree with every conclusion, but if you care about how systems actually function, not just how they sound in a speech, then this conversation matters. If this series made you think, challenged you, or even made you uncomfortable, that's the point. Make sure you're subscribed to the things that bother me so you don't miss what comes next. Like the video if you value real structural conversations. Comment, especially if you live this reality. Share it with someone who still thinks collapse can be isolated. We're not here for slogans. We're here to understand how things actually work. This is the things that bother me. Until next time.